You don't bring your past into a room like this unless you're ready to be reminded of your place. Ryan Brooks didn't lower his voice when he said it, and that was the point. The clink of champagne glasses paused just long enough for a few nearby guests to catch the tone, if not every word, and when Olivia Bennet stepped fully into the light of the ballroom. Heels quiet against polished marble, she knew exactly what he was doing because he'd always preferred his cruelty dressed as casual honesty, something that could pass as a joke if anyone challenged him, something that left her with no clean way to respond without looking like the problem. She stood there anyway, one hand resting lightly against the strap of her evening clutch, her other hand steady at her side, posture straight but not stiff. As if she had measured this moment long before she walked through the doors, and for a second, just a second, the memory tried to surface, her standing in a smaller kitchen years ago, barefoot, reading numbers off a grocery receipt while their son slept in the next room, Ryan pacing behind her talking about risks and timing and how she wouldn't understand, but the memory faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the present. Warm gold lighting, low music, a skyline stretching beyond the glass walls, and Ryan standing in a tailored suit that fit him better now that someone else was paying for it. He let his gaze move over her, not with surprise, but with evaluation, like he was checking whether she had changed enough to matter, and when his girlfriend, young, polished, unfamiliar, tilted her head and asked, "You know her?" Ryan smiled, the kind of smile Olivia used to mistake for charm, and said, "We used to be married," like it was a punchline that needed no setup. A couple nearby chuckled softly, not unkind, just curious, and Olivia felt the weight of their attention settle. Light but undeniable, like dust in the air you only notice when the light hits it just right. She could have spoken then, could have corrected the narrative, could have reminded him of the nights she stayed up building spreadsheets for a future he later claimed as his own, but instead she let the silence hold, her expression unchanged, her breathing even, eyes calm in a way that didn't invite pity or argument, and when Ryan added, almost lazily, "She always had a habit of showing up where she doesn't belong," Olivia simply shifted her gaze past him, as if the comment had already lost relevance the moment it left his mouth, as if the room had more important things waiting for her than a man who needed an audience to feel tall, and somewhere behind the music, behind the quiet murmurs and the soft scrape of chairs, something subtle began to tilt, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the air no longer felt entirely on his side. The laughter behind her did not follow as far as Ryan expected, and that was the first thing Olivia noticed as she moved deeper into the room. Past a table of untouched hors d'oeuvres and into a quieter pocket near the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city lights stretched for miles like something distant and untouchable. She paused there, not to hide, but to breathe in a rhythm that had taken her years to relearn. Steady and unshaken, the kind that did not depend on who was watching, and for a moment her reflection in the glass met her eyes, not the version Ryan remembered, not the woman who once asked for reassurance in a voice too soft to carry across a room, but someone sharper now, someone who had learned how to exist without asking permission. A server passed by, and she accepted a glass of sparkling water, the condensation cool against her fingers, grounding, real, and when she lifted it slightly, not to drink but to hold, it reminded her of another night, years earlier, when she sat at a small kitchen table long after midnight, a cheap desk lamp flickering above scattered papers as she recalculated expenses again and again, trying to make numbers stretch further than they were meant to go while Ryan slept in the next room. Confident in a future he had already begun to build without her, she remembered the quiet of that apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of her own breath when she finally stopped trying to fix something that was never hers to carry alone, and how the next morning she packed a single suitcase, not dramatically, not angrily, just deliberately, like someone choosing direction over comfort. The memory did not sting anymore. It settled, like a closed chapter she no longer needed to reread. Behind her, the room shifted subtly. Conversations adjusting in tone, glances returning not to Ryan, but toward her, curious now, uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with pity, and when she turned slightly, she caught the edge of a whispered question, someone asking who she was with, a kind of interest that had not been there before. Olivia did not answer. She did not move toward them or away. She simply stood there, composed, present, as if the room itself had begun to recalibrate around her, and somewhere across the floor, Ryan's voice faded just enough to reveal something new beneath it. Not control, not certainty, but the first quiet hint that whatever story he thought he was telling was no longer the one people were hearing. Ryan felt it before he understood it, the subtle shift in attention that no longer anchored itself to him but drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the far side of the room where Olivia stood as if she had always belonged there. He tried to recover it with a laugh, a quick comment to the couple beside him about how some people never quite move on, but the words landed softer this time, thinner, like they had lost the weight he was used to carrying them with, and when he glanced back again, it was not her expression that unsettled him, it was the absence of reaction, the complete lack of urgency in her posture, as if whatever he thought he held over her had already expired without his permission. Olivia, meanwhile, lowered her glass slightly, the cool rim no longer needed as an anchor, her attention drawn not by the room but by the quiet realization settling into her chest, something steady and unfamiliar in its certainty, because for the first time since she walked in, she was not measuring the space by who might judge her. She was simply standing inside it, fully, without negotiation. A group of executives near the center table shifted their conversation, one of them glancing toward Olivia with a flicker of recognition that did not come with a name yet but carried interest, the kind that traveled quickly in rooms like this, and when one of them leaned closer to another and asked something under his breath, the answer came with a slight nod in her direction, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to ripple outward. Ryan noticed that too, the way heads turned just a fraction longer than before, the way his girlfriend's smile tightened as she followed his gaze and found Olivia no longer framed as a past mistake but as something unresolved, something not fully understood. The music changed, softer now, and in that softened space Olivia shifted her weight, not retreating, not advancing, simply repositioning as if aligning herself with a current no one else could quite feel yet, and as she did, a man near the entrance paused mid-step, his attention locking onto her with quiet precision, not surprise, not curiosity, but recognition so controlled it almost looked like intention, and without announcing himself, without drawing the room's focus, he began to walk in her direction, each step unhurried, deliberate, as if the shift everyone was beginning to sense had just found its center. He did not rush, and that was the first thing that set him apart from everyone else in the room, because in a space where people moved quickly to be seen, his pace carried the quiet authority of someone who did not need to announce his presence. Olivia noticed him only when he was close enough that the air around her seemed to settle differently, not heavier, not lighter, just more defined, and when she turned slightly, their eyes met with a familiarity that had never required introduction. The kind built over months of unseen collaboration, late-night exchanges, and decisions made in silence rather than spectacle. "You made it," he said, his voice even, almost understated, as if this room was no different from any other place they had ever crossed paths, and Olivia allowed a small nod, the corner of her expression softening just enough to acknowledge what stood between them without exposing it to anyone else. Alexander Knight did not look around to assess who was watching. He did not lower his voice, and he did not offer any gesture that could be mistaken for performance. He simply stood beside her as if that had always been the natural arrangement, and in that quiet alignment, something else shifted, something sharper this time, because across the room, recognition did not spread loudly. It moved in fragments, a paused sentence here, a second glance there, until it reached the people who understood exactly who he was without needing confirmation. Ryan saw it in pieces, first in the way one of the Executives he had been trying to impress suddenly lost focus mid-conversation, then in the way his girlfriend's attention followed the same invisible thread pulling across the room, and when his eyes finally landed on the man now standing beside Olivia. The change was immediate, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a calculation being corrected in real time. Olivia did not turn toward Ryan. She did not acknowledge the distance collapsing between past and present. She simply adjusted her grip on the glass before setting it aside on a nearby table, freeing her hands as if preparing for something that did not require defense, only presence. And when Alexander spoke again, quieter this time but no less certain, "They have been waiting to meet you." It was not an invitation, it was a transition, one that placed her exactly where she had been building toward all along, and without hesitation, without looking back, Olivia stepped forward with him, leaving behind not just a conversation, but the version of herself that had once needed to survive it. The path across the ballroom felt shorter than it should have, not because the distance had changed, but because the weight she used to carry through rooms like this was no longer there, and as Olivia walked beside Alexander, she noticed the way conversations adjusted before they even reached the table, chairs subtly repositioned, bodies turning just enough to acknowledge an arrival that did not need to be announced. No one asked who she was, not directly, because the answer was already forming. In the way Alexander placed his hand lightly at the center of the table, a gesture that was not possessive, not protective, just precise, as if aligning the moment with intention, and when the first executive extended his hand, his attention was not on Alexander, it was on her, measured and deliberate. "We have heard quite a bit about your work," he said. Voice calm but carrying a level of respect that did not belong to introductions, and Olivia met his handshake with the same steady composure she had carried all evening, her grip firm, her gaze level, offering nothing excessive, nothing performative. Just presence, the conversation that followed did not revolve around her past, it moved forward, into strategy, projections, decisions that shaped outcomes far beyond this room, and as she spoke, not louder than necessary, not faster than required. Each word landed with clarity that did not seek approval, it simply existed with it, and across the room, Ryan watched the shift complete itself in ways he could not interrupt, because this was no longer about what he said earlier. It was about what he could not access now. He recognized the names being exchanged, the companies, the stakes, the kind of opportunities he had been trying to reach for months, and yet the barrier between him and that table was no longer distance, it was relevance. His girlfriend leaned closer, asking something he did not fully hear, because his focus had narrowed, locked onto the image of Olivia not reacting, not defending, but belonging in a space he had assumed would always remain out of her reach. At the table, Alexander spoke only when necessary, each comment brief, each acknowledgement reinforcing the same unspoken truth, that Olivia was not there because of him. She was there because of what she had built long before anyone in that room realized it. And when a tablet was passed across the table toward her, displaying figures and projections that carried the weight of real decisions, she did not hesitate. She leaned in slightly, scanning, adjusting, suggesting a revision with the quiet confidence of someone who had already solved problems no one else had seen coming, and in that moment, without a single dramatic gesture, without a single raised voice, the room settled into a new understanding that did not need to be explained, only recognized. The numbers on the screen shifted under Olivia's touch with a precision that made the conversation narrow around her, not because she demanded attention, but because accuracy had a way of pulling focus without asking. And as she adjusted a projection and outlined a cleaner path forward, one that reduced risk without sacrificing scale, the executive across from her leaned back slightly, studying her not as a guest, but as a decision-maker. Someone whose input did not need validation to carry weight. "That aligns with what we have been missing," he said, more to the table than to her, and the subtle change in tone settled deeper than any introduction could have, because it was not about who she was connected to, it was about what she delivered in real time. Alexander did not interrupt. He did not reinforce her words, he simply observed, his presence steady at her side, allowing the space to recognize her on its own terms, and in that restraint, the shift became irreversible. Across the room, Ryan finally moved, not with the confidence he carried earlier, but with a controlled urgency that tried to mask the distance he suddenly felt from the center of the conversation, and when he approached the table, pausing just at its edge as if unsure whether he still belonged within its orbit, one of the executives acknowledged him with a brief nod, polite but uninviting, the kind reserved for someone adjacent. Not essential, Ryan forced a smile, introducing himself again as if repetition could restore position, but before he could extend the conversation further, the same executive turned back toward Olivia, redirecting the focus with a simple question about her revised timeline, and just like that, the opening Ryan tried to create closed without resistance. Olivia did not look at him, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to address, her attention anchored fully in the discussion. Her voice calm as she clarified a detail that refined the entire proposal, and when the tablet was turned once more for final review, the room leaned in collectively, not toward Alexander, not toward status, but toward her. Ryan stood there for a moment longer, the quiet realization settling in a way no confrontation could have delivered, that whatever version of the story he had been telling about her no longer existed in this room, and as he stepped back unnoticed, the conversation continued without interruption, as if his presence had never been a factor to begin with. The agreement did not need a signature to feel settled. It was already written in the way the room leaned toward Olivia when she finished speaking, in the quiet pause that followed, not because there was uncertainty, but because there was nothing left to question. And as the executive across from her closed the tablet with a satisfied nod, the tone of the table shifted from evaluation to alignment, subtle but final. "We will move forward with this structure," he said, his gaze resting on Olivia, with a clarity that erased any ambiguity about where the decision had come from, and around them, glasses were lifted again, conversations resumed, but not in the same way as before. Because something had been established that could not be undone by earlier impressions. Alexander glanced at her briefly, not to confirm, not to lead, just a quiet acknowledgement that required no words, and Olivia returned the look with the same restraint. A mutual understanding built not on display, but on consistency. Across the room, Ryan stood near the edge now, no longer attempting to re-enter the circle, his posture composed, but his stillness revealing more than any expression could, because for the first time that evening, he was not observing her as someone from his past, he was watching her as someone positioned entirely outside his reach, someone whose direction no longer intersected with his in any meaningful way. His girlfriend spoke again, softer this time, asking if everything was all right, and he nodded automatically, though his attention did not leave the table, did not leave the quiet center where Olivia now stood fully integrated into a space he had spent months trying to access. At that same moment, one of the senior partners approached Alexander, extending a hand with a level of familiarity reserved for equals, and as they exchanged a brief greeting, the partner turned slightly toward Olivia, offering the same respect without hesitation. "We are glad you are finally here," he said, not as an introduction, but as a recognition delayed until the right moment, and Olivia accepted it with a small nod. Nothing excessive, nothing that sought to claim the room, because she did not need to. She had already changed it. Ryan exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the realization settled not in a single instant, but in layers, each one stripping away the version of control he thought he had held, until all that remained was the quiet understanding that whatever energy he had tried to shape at the beginning of the night had long since moved beyond him, redirected, refined, and ultimately claimed by someone who never needed to raise her voice to do it. The music softened again, not because the night was ending, but because the tone of the room had settled into something more deliberate, more selective, and Olivia felt it in the way conversations no longer reached for her attention but instead waited for it. As if her presence had quietly redefined what mattered, she stepped slightly away from the table, not to leave, but to create space, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the glass she had set down earlier, now forgotten. Unnecessary, and Alexander moved with her without signaling it, his pace matching hers in a way that felt practiced, though neither of them had ever rehearsed this moment. "You handled that exactly as I expected," he said, his voice low, not for secrecy, but for precision, and Olivia allowed a faint exhale, the closest thing to a release she had permitted herself all evening, because the weight she once carried into rooms like this no longer followed her out of them. Across the ballroom, Ryan remained where he was, but the distance between them had become something else entirely, no longer measured in feet or steps, but in relevance, in access, in the quiet reality that the space she now occupied was one he could not simply walk into anymore. He watched as one of the senior partners approached Olivia again, this time with a document in hand, not as a test, not as an introduction, but as a continuation, and when Olivia reviewed it briefly before offering a concise adjustment, the partner nodded without hesitation, accepting her input as final rather than optional. Ryan's expression did not collapse, it did something quieter. Something more revealing. It recalibrated, as if trying to reconcile the version of her he had dismissed with the one standing in front of him now, and failing to connect them. His girlfriend shifted beside him, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful silence, as if she too sensed that whatever narrative had been constructed at the beginning of the night had dissolved without confrontation. Olivia did not look in their direction, not once, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to prove. And as she turned slightly toward Alexander, her posture relaxed, not from exhaustion, but from completion. She understood that the shift everyone had felt was not temporary, not situational, it was permanent, rooted in something far deeper than a single evening, and when Alexander met her glance with a subtle nod, it was not approval, it was recognition of something already established, something that no longer required validation from anyone else in the room. The night did not end with applause, it settled into something quieter, something that lingered in the spaces people carried with them as they moved, and Olivia felt it as she stepped away from the center of the room for the final time, not withdrawing, not escaping, but simply transitioning, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if nothing about the evening had required effort, only presence. Alexander walked beside her without speaking, his silence aligned with hers, not empty, but complete, and as they reached the edge of the ballroom where the city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass, Olivia paused for a brief moment, her gaze resting on the reflection that no longer asked who she used to be. Because that question had already been answered long before she arrived. Behind them, conversations resumed at full volume, names exchanged, plans extended, but none of it reached her in the same way anymore. It existed at a distance, part of a world she could enter or leave without losing herself. Across the room, Ryan remained where he stood, not because he could not move, but because he no longer knew where to go within a space that had quietly reorganized itself without him. And when his eyes found Olivia one last time, there was no confrontation waiting there, no acknowledgement offered, only the undeniable reality that she had stepped beyond the version of her he once defined. His girlfriend spoke again, softer than before. But he did not respond immediately, because the silence surrounding him now was different from hers. It did not hold strength, it held absence, the kind that follows when something irreversible has already taken place. Olivia turned slightly toward Alexander, a small, effortless motion, and with a calm that required no emphasis, she said, "We should go, not as a retreat, but as a decision already made," and he nodded once, matching her tone without adding to it. Together, they moved toward the exit, their steps steady, unremarkable to anyone who did not understand what had just shifted, and as the doors opened and the cooler night air met them outside, Olivia did not look back, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that belonged to her anymore. The lights of the city reflected softly against the glass doors as they closed, sealing the room, the voices, the past on the other side, and in that final quiet, the truth of the night settled without resistance. clear and unspoken, that she had not returned to reclaim anything that was lost. She had simply arrived as someone who no longer needed it.